Level 1 is the 22 LR handgun. The 22 long rifle is often considered the ideal starting point for a new handgun shooter, and it's also a cartridge that experienced competitive shooters return to when they want to sharpen their fundamentals. The reason is simple. The minimal recoil removes much of the distraction and puts the focus almost entirely on the shooter's technique. A 22 LR handgun produces extremely little felt recoil, roughly 0.2 foot-pounds in a typical pistol. That means grip, trigger control, sight alignment, and sight picture become the primary factors determining accuracy. There's very little recoil anticipation to fight, almost no flinch to overcome, and minimal muzzle movement to manage between shots. In that sense, the 22 LR strips handgun shooting down to its most basic elements. The most common 22 LR handguns are semi-automatic pistols, with the Ruger Mark IV series and earlier Mark models being among the best-known rimfire pistols in the American market. At the budget end, the Heritage Rough Rider offers a single-action revolver option. Ammunition is another major advantage. A 500-round box of standard velocity 22 LR commonly costs around $25 to $40, making extensive practice far less expensive than training with most centerfire handguns. An afternoon at an American shooting range with a 22 LR can cost a fraction of what the same number of rounds would cost with a centerfire pistol. That low operating cost is one reason shooting instructors often encourage new shooters to spend significant time developing their fundamentals with 22 LR before moving to centerfire calibers. There is, however, one important mechanical limitation that new 22 LR shooters need to understand. Rimfire ammunition uses priming compound distributed around the rim of the cartridge rather than a primer located in the center of the case. Because of that design, rimfire ammunition generally has a higher rate of failures to fire than quality centerfire ammunition. Misfires can happen more frequently, particularly with inexpensive or older ammunition, which makes understanding basic malfunction procedures an important part of learning to operate a 22 LR semi-automatic pistol. On the range, a misfire is an opportunity to learn how the firearm responds to an ammunition problem. In a defensive situation, however, a failure to fire can have much more serious consequences. That distinction is one reason a 22 LR handgun is generally viewed as a training and recreational platform rather than the first choice for defensive use. The other major limitation is performance. The small, relatively low-velocity rimfire projectile does not generally provide the same level of penetration and expansion consistency associated with modern centerfire defensive ammunition. So Level 1 is primarily about learning the fundamentals, building confidence, and developing good shooting habits. That foundation matters because the skills learned without significant recoil carry directly into every level that follows. The more solid those fundamentals become at Level 1, the easier it is to manage the additional challenges introduced later. Level 2 is the 9mm handgun. The 9mm Luger is one of the most widely used handgun cartridges in the world, and it is chambered in an enormous range of defensive pistols, service handguns, and competition platforms. Moving from 22 LR to 9mm represents one of the biggest jumps in the handgun progression because it introduces the shooter to centerfire ammunition and meaningful recoil for the first time. A typical full-size 9mm handgun produces roughly 6 to 8 foot-pounds of recoil energy, depending on the firearm and ammunition. Compared with a 22 LR, that is a substantial increase. But the number itself can sound more intimidating than the experience actually feels. With a proper grip and stable shooting position, 9mm recoil is generally manageable for most shooters. Instead of the heavier push associated with some larger handgun calibers, 9mm typically produces a quick, sharp impulse. A trained shooter can recover from that movement rapidly and return the sights to the target. For someone who has built solid fundamentals with a 22 LR, the transition can be surprisingly smooth. The dominance of 9mm in the American defensive handgun market was reinforced by two major developments. The first was the FBI's decision in 2014 to move back toward 9mm after years of using larger calibers. Testing indicated that modern 9mm defensive ammunition could provide penetration in and expansion performance comparable to larger service calibers while offering lower recoil and greater magazine capacity. The second development was the improvement of modern defensive ammunition. Loads such as Hornady Critical Defense, Federal HST, and Speer Gold Dot have been designed to provide consistent expansion and adequate penetration in standardized ballistic testing. Modern 9mm ammunition has therefore made the cartridge far more capable than the older reputation of the caliber might suggest. Level 2 is where many serious defensive handgun shooters ultimately settle, because 9mm offers a balance of controllability, capacity, cost, and modern ammunition performance that makes moving to larger calibers unnecessary for many people. Level 3 is the 40 S&W handgun. The 40 S&W was born out of a major turning point in American law enforcement. In April 1986, 8 FBI agents confronted 2 bank robbers in a gunfight in Miami, Florida. In an incident that became one of the most studied shootings in the history of American law enforcement, 2 agents were killed and 5 others were wounded, despite multiple hits being scored on both suspects with 38 special and 9mm ammunition. Several of those hits failed to stop the suspects immediately, raising serious questions about handgun effectiveness and ammunition selection. The aftermath of the Miami shootout pushed the FBI toward the 10mm Auto as its new service cartridge. But the full-power 10mm produced more recoil than many agents could comfortably manage, especially during rapid follow-up shots. That problem eventually led to the development of the 40 S&W, which was designed to deliver performance associated with the 10mm in a shorter cartridge that could fit into handguns based on 9mm-sized frames. The recoil of the 40 S&W is often described by experienced shooters as snappy. Instead of the relatively quick push of a 9mm or the heavier, slower shove of a 45 ACP, the 40 produces a sharp impulse accompanied by noticeable muzzle rise. That characteristic can make the cartridge more demanding for shooters who are still developing their technique. A shooter with a strong, consistent grip can handle the 40 S&W effectively. But someone with a loose grip or inconsistent wrist position may find that the sharper recoil makes it harder to get the sights back on target quickly. Compared with 9mm in particular, small differences in grip technique can become much more obvious when shooting 40 S&W. There is also an interesting training benefit to that added difficulty. Rather than immediately moving to a more comfortable caliber, working through the recoil of the 40 S&W can force a shooter to become more disciplined about grip pressure, wrist position, and trigger control. Those skills can transfer to other handguns as well. Some competitive shooters who spent years training with 40 S&W before 9mm became dominant have described the transition to 9mm as relatively easy. The lighter recoil and faster recovery of 9mm can feel much more manageable after a shooter has already developed strong recoil control fundamentals with a 40. The 40-yard S&W became one of the dominant handgun calibers in American law enforcement from the 1990s through the 2010s. The FBI's adoption of the cartridge, after moving away from the full-power 10mm, influenced numerous police departments across the country, many of which adopted 40 S&W as their standard service caliber. That trend eventually reversed. In 2017, the FBI announced its return to 9mm, and many law enforcement agencies subsequently followed. Better 9mm ammunition, lower recoil, higher capacity, and lower training costs all contributed to the shift. The 40 S&W has therefore become less common than it once was, but it remains an established defensive caliber with a large number of existing handguns and a broad selection of ammunition. Level 4 is the 45 ACP handgun. The 45 ACP is one of the most historically important handgun cartridges in American firearms history. Designed by John Moses Browning in the early 20th century, it was developed for the pistol that would become the M1911, which was adopted by the United States military in 1911. The 45 ACP M1911 remained in American military service through 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam, before the US military began transitioning to 9mm in the 1980s. Because of that history, the 45 ACP and the 1911 became deeply embedded in American firearms culture. In fact, the debate between 45 ACP and 9mm has become one of the longest-running arguments in American shooting culture. It has generated decades of magazine articles, internet discussions, range conversations, and competing opinions about which cartridge is better. The recoil of the 45 ACP feels different from both the 40 S&W and 9mm. Rather than the sharp snap of the 40, the 45 is generally described as a heavier, slower push. A common 45 ACP load uses a 230-grain bullet traveling at roughly 830 feet per second from a traditional 5-inch 1911 barrel. Depending on the firearm and ammunition, recoil energy can be noticeably higher than 9mm. Despite that, many experienced shooters find 45 ACP recoil relatively predictable. The impulse tends to feel more like a sustained push than the quick snap associated with 40 S&W. That predictable recoil can make the cartridge feel more manageable than the raw numbers might suggest. The traditional 1911 design also contributes to the shooting experience. Its weight, grip shape, and operating system influence how recoil is distributed through the shooter's hand. The result is a shooting characteristic that has helped keep the 45 ACP 1911 popular for more than a century. The biggest practical difference between a traditional 45 ACP 1911 and modern 9mm polymer frame pistols, however, is capacity. A traditional 1911 commonly carries 7 or 8 rounds depending on the magazine, while a full-size 9mm such as a Glock 17 can carry 17 rounds in a standard magazine, and a full-size Sig Sauer P320 in 9mm can carry 17 rounds depending on the magazine configuration. That capacity difference is real, and it represents a genuine trade-off that anyone who chooses to carry a 1911 has to weigh. Supporters point to the 1911's excellent trigger, comfortable ergonomics, and the long-established performance of the 45 ACP cartridge as reasons those advantages can outweigh the loss in capacity for their particular needs. Others see the lower capacity as a decisive disadvantage that no trigger advantage can make up for. Both perspectives are reasonable because at level 4, the 1911 debate is less about finding one objectively superior handgun and more about deciding which characteristics matter most to the individual shooter. The single-action trigger is one of the 1911's most important mechanical differences. Operating the pistol safely requires an understanding of its manual safety, grip safety, and traditional cocked and locked configuration. Those are additional manual operations that shooters using the striker-fired pistols common at earlier levels generally don't have to manage. A properly configured 1911 can have a trigger that breaks around 3.5 to 5 pounds with very little travel. That produces an exceptionally clean trigger break compared with many production handguns. It's one reason experienced shooters who have mastered the 1911's controls continue to favor the platform for competition, even though its magazine capacity is significantly lower than that of many modern polymer frame pistols. Level 5 is the 10mm auto handgun. The 10mm auto was developed in the late 1970s with an ambitious goal: create a semi-automatic handgun cartridge that offered greater external and terminal performance than .45 ACP, deeper penetration than 9mm, and the faster reload capability of a semi-automatic pistol. The concept became a reality in the early 1980s with the Norma-loaded 10mm and the Bren 10 pistol. The Bren 10 gained an unexpected place in American pop culture when Sonny Crockett carried one on Miami Vice, but the pistol itself struggled commercially. Production problems, quality control issues, and magazine shortages hurt the platform badly, leaving some owners with a handgun that was difficult to keep supplied with magazines. Those problems ultimately weren't a failure of the 10mm cartridge itself. The cartridge survived the collapse of the Bren 10 and eventually found a more successful home in platforms such as the Glock 20 and Colt Delta Elite. The 10mm was designed to occupy a space between traditional service calibers and more powerful Magnum Revolver cartridges, and its performance can overlap with the lower end of .357 Magnum territory, depending on the ammunition being compared. One of its major advantages is the semi-automatic platform. Unlike a traditional 6-shot revolver, a 10mm pistol can offer substantially greater magazine capacity and much faster reloads. That combination gives the shooter considerably more ammunition available before a reload is required. The trade-off is recoil. Full-power 10mm loads can produce roughly 15 to 20 foot-pounds of recoil energy in a full-size pistol, such as the Glock 20, depending on the ammunition and firearm. That's a substantial increase over 9mm and 45 ACP, and it makes the 10mm one of the more demanding mainstream semi-automatic handgun cartridges to control during rapid fire. Its reputation comes primarily from its ballistic performance. A common full-power load might launch a 180-grain bullet at around 200 feet per second from a barrel in the 4.5 to 5-inch range. Although actual performance varies considerably with ammunition and barrel length, those numbers give the 10mm considerably more energy than conventional service cartridges. That combination of power, penetration, and semi-automatic capacity has made the 10mm particularly popular among hunters, guides, and outdoors enthusiasts who spend time in areas where encounters with large predators are a concern. For those users, the appeal isn't simply raw power. It's having a relatively powerful handgun that can still provide multiple shots and relatively quick reloads in a semi-automatic platform. Level 6 is the 357 Magnum Revolver. The 357 Magnum is one of the cartridges that helped define the era of high-performance handgun ammunition. Introduced in 1934 through the work of firearms enthusiasts and designers including Elmer Keith, Philip Sharp, and Smith & Wesson, it was developed to outperform the .38 Special, particularly against tougher targets and at greater distances. At its full potential, 357 Magnum can produce slightly more energy than many 10mm loads, although the comparison depends heavily on the specific ammunition, barrel length, and firearm being used. Raw cartridge specifications don't tell the entire story. The handgun itself plays a major role in how effectively that performance can be used. That's why Level 6 isn't defined solely by the power of the 357 Magnum cartridge. It's also about the platform most commonly associated with it, the revolver. Moving from a semi-automatic pistol to a revolver requires the shooter to learn a different manual of operation. There is no detachable magazine, no reciprocating slide, and no striker-fired operating system. In some respects, the revolver is mechanically straightforward. In others, it demands more from the shooter. A double-action revolver trigger can require around 12 to 14 pounds of pressure, while the same revolver may have a single-action trigger closer to 3 to 5 pounds. That heavy double-action pull requires considerably more deliberate trigger control than the relatively light, consistent trigger pulls found on many modern striker-fired pistols. A 158-grain 357 Magnum fired from a 44-ounce revolver produces substantially more recoil than a 115-grain 9mm fired from a 32-ounce handgun. The difference becomes even more dramatic in a lightweight snub-nose revolver, which is one of the configurations most commonly associated with concealed carry. The Lee